Good morning, everyone. Thanks for that introduction, Skip. So the title of this morning's session is How to Run Remote Workshops That Make a Difference. My name is Shaun Miller, and I'm a digital experience consultant at a company called Codehouse. We build effective digital products with fast-growing and large organizations, and we do that through two axes. First of all, we work to help companies define their strategy and continually optimize towards those goals as they change, inevitably as the business landscape evolves. And we use the tools of design and development to create those digital solutions. This session is with thanks to the content management teams around the world who are providing and delivering valuable content to all of us. So the brief agenda for today's session is, first of all, what are workshops and what do they look like today in the kind of current crisis that we find ourselves in, and what might be the relevance for remote workshops tomorrow. And then second of all, then we look at the 3 T's of planning and delivering remote workshops, and finally thinking about some of those troubleshooting tips to overcome some of the almost inevitable things that happen when you're hosting remote and virtual workshops. So I like to think about this old tale of the blind men that come across an elephant, and they all feel different parts of that element, and as a result they think that they understand the elephant. Someone feels a trunk, someone feels an ear, and all of them come to believe that their view, their personal experience of this elephant is correct. And sometimes I feel like when all of us walk into a particular business opportunity or challenge, we all have this particular lens on things. And so the purpose of workshops, as we all probably know, is to bring those collective ideas and mindsets together and come together to find a unique and compiled way of addressing those problems. And so one of the ways that we do that, when we think about a workshop, the typical thing is we think about post-it notes on a wall, and that's all great, and that has worked in the context of where perhaps we have everyone working within the same space. So in the traditional sense of a workshop, everyone comes to the same room. Perhaps some people fly in from abroad. Many of our customers have international offices, so in some cases they bring people in. But in other cases, you have this idea of 2 split teams. You have a team located in A and another team located in location B. And that hybrid model we also see with organizations that are growing quite quickly, that have perhaps like small satellite offices, maybe 1 or 2 people, and they want to get those contributions in those workshops. But ultimately what happens is you actually have a cluster of people in one space, but then these people sort of dialing in. And actually, what we find is sometimes if you're going with an offline approach to workshops first, that actually sometimes the experience isn't as good for those people in those satellite locations as it could be. And so we actually think that there is an opportunity to think about digital first or virtual remote first for workshops as a way to be more inclusive of our international colleagues. And so that's the kind of the model where we find ourselves today, where basically because we're all working from home, essentially we're forced to do remote. But this talk is about saying, well, how can you do that well today, but also take in some of the lessons as we move back towards perhaps something a bit closer to what we knew beforehand. With the goal of obviously everyone being aligned and it being getting to some great outcomes. So second of all, what are the 3 T's of planning and running a remote workshop? And we think about all of those in the kind of context of the storyline or the arc of actually what a workshop is. You have the first step of actually preparing for the workshop, then delivering the workshop itself, and then the follow-up. So the 3 T's are teams, tools, and techniques. And let's first of all look at teams. So when we think about teams, whilst obviously they're involved throughout, and we need to kind of be contributing and communicating with those people, we think about planning who needs to be there at the start. So the 2 things that we think about are who needs to be there and timing. So there's different bits about thinking about who needs to be there. There's the before the workshop, there's obviously during the session, and then there's of course afterwards. And in terms of before, we think about who needs to be informed, and like any good planning process, we think about our racing matrix. Who needs to be aware that this workshop's happening, but perhaps they actually don't need to be involved in the day-to-day of actually kind of coming up with the content and it itself happening. And then in terms of during, we then think about if we're running a workshop, if we've got some senior stakeholders, some people who are quite hard to get hold of their time for, well, how do we make the best use of their time? What can we do that as we talk about in the timing, the next section, to leverage some asynchronous approaches and not doing everything together at the same time to get the best of our contributors' energies and skills. And then finally, after, who do we then need to basically update? And there's often a commonality between before and the after, and the during sometimes is different. But who do we need to let know that these things have happened, and what are some of the outcomes and decisions that have been made? So then looking at timing, we then think about, well, there are 3 things. So first of all, we look at time zones. So one of the things that we found with many of our international customers is that in the physical workshop environment, often the people who are on kind of difficult time zones are their experience is deprecated, is given a lesser importance. Whereas we think actually with doing remote workshops, there's actually a better opportunity to accommodate people from across the globe. Just 2 weeks ago, we did a workshop with someone dialing in from Dallas, a number of people dialing in from across Europe, and a number of people dialing in from Singapore and Australia, all into the same workshop. And actually the timing worked really well. But it's not easy, and there are things that we have to do to make that work. So the first thing is, as I mentioned before, asynchronous workshop running. So asynchronous meaning, well, it doesn't all have to happen at the same time. There's sometimes when we think about the sort of physical workshop setup, we often think about, well, we're flying people in, we might as well just bash out in 2 days, or how it has to be half a day, or it has to be a whole day. Well, in the virtual workshop sort of setting, it doesn't have to be all those things. And in fact, actually, when we think about the duration of a workshop, perhaps actually something like an hour and a half, or probably what would have been a half-day workshop, or maybe only a few hours, perhaps split into 2, if it was going to be a whole-day workshop, actually works better. And in terms of an asynchronous collaboration, what that really means is perhaps you have some sort of introduction to the workshop that you do at the same time, asking and answering any questions that people have. And there are some tasks that can then be done offline, which you then come back together as a whole group to then discuss, debate, assimilate, and then come to some decisions. Point being that things don't always have to happen at the same time. Okay, so how do we make that happen? So in terms of tools, we think about there's kind of two main elements. There's the communication part, and then there's also the capturing part. So from a communication perspective, going back to that timeline of thinking about the workshops. So in terms of before, it's actually pretty useful and necessary to be communicating to all the people who are going to be involved in this workshop, typically email. One of the critical things that needs to be done with virtual workshops, perhaps even more so than physical ones, is actually basically providing some extra information about what to expect from this workshop, what kind of pre-work can be done, and also basically showing some of the setup. A tool like Loom is basically a screen recording, screen capturing tool. And that's quite a neat way of basically sending people an introduction to the workshop, get them excited, and also show them what they're going to be doing when they join that virtual workshop. And then we also suggest something like Teams, perhaps or Teams or Slack, you can open a channel and then basically put everyone who's going to be in that workshop into one space. So if there are questions that are coming up before the session, you can answer them, some of them then. Then during the session, now, I've put Zoom up here, but obviously it could be any of the other web conferencing tools, the likes of Teams or Google Meet. Any of those are appropriate, but the main point being that we want to have some way of communicating synchronously, so that people can actually see and perhaps even communicate live with each other. So video chat is obviously important. One thing to note that some research has been found in terms of video conferencing is that actually it is more exhausting than just voice alone. So one thing that we found is actually perhaps at the start of the workshop, use the video functionality, make sure everyone knows who everyone is in the room. But then when you kind of get into some of the tasks, it's not as important. Having said that, sometimes some of those non-verbal cues are helpful in these virtual workshops, things like thumbs up and subtle nodding. But there's a trade-off to be had there. So then moving into the after phase, obviously following up in terms of email again with everyone. Perhaps if you've got your chat tool and your channel open, then use that too. But making sure there's somewhere to document everything that's been captured. So just as a quick little checklist of things that we should be doing as part of any remote workshop, things that we have to do, first of all, is make sure that everyone has access to and is familiar with the tools that we're suggesting. So that sounds like a simple thing to do, but sometimes people haven't used some of the video conferencing tools, they haven't downloaded the desktop client, which makes for a better experience. Or once we then start moving into some of these capturing tools, then people then need to be aware of some of the basics of how they can actually contribute. Because if you're putting someone into an environment which they're unfamiliar with, it helps to reassure them and show them some of the basics before actually jumping into the exercises itself. So the key thing in terms of capture, so we've seen different approaches. Obviously, when you're face to face in an offline experience, well, then you're using post-it notes and you're drawing stuff and you're writing stuff up on physical artifacts. But in the virtual space, we think that actually something like Google Docs or Word or even just screen sharing those, it probably isn't the right tool. It's fine, but often in a workshop context, things are unstructured. And so you need something like a virtual whiteboard, the likes of Miro or Mural, to help first capture those ideas and then be a canvas by which you can then structure those ideas down into something a bit more concrete. So, for example, this is just a screenshot recording from Miro, where the idea is you can have multiple people all interacting on the canvas at the same time. Obviously, this is highly sped up, but you can see lots of mouses moving around and people basically using the same workspace to come to some ideas and conclusions about what they're working on. So a highly interactive experience. And the idea being that you can see what everyone else is working on as well at the same time. So it feels and replicates some of the virtual or sort of the physical world experience. But the benefit of this is actually when you have people from all around the world, now suddenly there's no preference between people who are in the same space. Everyone is on a level playing field. So thinking about techniques in a remote workshops. So the kind of typical structure of kind of any workshop has this idea of where we're going broader, we're ideating and coming up with ideas. At some point, we're then trying to consolidate them, see where the overlaps are, we're trying to cluster them, consolidate, and then making some decisions towards the end. So some of the things that we found that are critical when you're running remote workshops, pretty much the same as, to a certain extent, as physical ones, is that it's useful to have co-facilitators. Sometimes that might mean someone if you're working in the UK, but you have some colleagues working in America, perhaps also just having someone also on that time zone who's kind of going through, maybe waking up slightly earlier in the day than you have to join it. Just it helps to make things run more smoothly. Make sure there is just a note taker. The idea behind the virtual whiteboard canvas is that everyone can contribute, but it's helpful to have someone who is basically identified as someone who will capture specific notes as well, that maybe when people aren't doing specific exercises and adding things themselves. And the final thing, like any good workshop, to have someone who's keeping a track of time. Now, these canvases that I mentioned, the virtual whiteboards, they do have their own timing tools as well, which helps for specific exercises, but it's good just to have someone beyond the main facilitator who's keeping an eye on time. And one thing that is key is that if you're doing some of these activities for the first time, is make sure to practice them. It's quite helpful just to get a couple friendly colleagues onto a call beforehand, walk them through what you're planning on doing in the session, and just seeing, do the mechanics of this make sense? And finally, when you're actually in the workshop, then make sure as you start a new exercise, make sure to introduce it as thoroughly as you can and pause and ask for questions. What you don't want is people who, particularly, it's difficult when it's in the room and people don't understand the exercise that they've been asked to do, but when it's remote, it gets even harder because you don't want people then switching off. So the key is to make sure people are engaged and understand the activities that they're being asked to do. So feel free to create the time to allow people to ask those questions if they don't understand what the activity is or how to use the tool itself. So this is just a couple examples from Miro. So this is a canvas as a whole. I've just cropped part of it. But what I wanted to show here is that one of the ways to lay out the canvas, a bit different to how you might do it in the physical world, is that you lay out all of the activities in advance on this virtual canvas. You might do that in a physical room by laying out what's expected to happen, but this is so key to do in a virtual environment, so that you basically are saying, these are the things we're going to work on, and in each space you then provide an introduction to that exercise as well. So you're basically you're explaining what they're going to have to do in text, but also when you do the exercise, you're going to be explaining to them verbally as well. But it's just helpful as a little reminder as they're doing the exercise, if they have to just check back to see the instructions, that it's there all in one place. So the idea basically is that we're creating the environment for this workshop to happen all in one place. So some other things just to think about as far as this overall how to run these remote workshops is to, as I say, to lay out the whole agenda on the digital whiteboard. But one of the things to think about also is that it's useful to have a second screen as the main moderator, so that you can see basically what everyone else can see if you're doing a screen share of your own screen, but also to be able to see participants if people are on video as well. So it's just a useful way to kind of keep track of what you're doing as the main kind of leader of the workshop, but also to be able to see what other people are seeing as well. And that comes in handy as we start to talk about some of the troubleshooting techniques, because you can then see perhaps what's going wrong. Because one of the things that we want to avoid is that feeling that, I kind of get it, this was a good meeting, but it could have been better. So some of the things that kind of happen, and it's totally fine, because everyone understands that nothing's perfect, that our technologies, even if we're working for a technology company, that nothing is perfect, and these things can happen. So some of the things that we've seen and tried to then basically overcome is, well, people sometimes they're bored, maybe they're distracted, they're multitasking, they've got a number of children sort of running around. So some of the things that we need to do to kind of massage those situations, those challenges is basically just to check in with people. Do people need a comfort break? Do people need 5 minutes off just to go and take care of some family issues or something that's happening around the house? Things I mentioned already is just in terms of tech failure, people's Wi-Fi drops off from a noise, and suddenly there's this weird feedback happening. That can happen. It's just one of those things. From a feedback perspective, and one quick tip, if you can hear the feedback, then it's probably not your issue, it's probably someone else. And this is we're all very polite and we don't want to call it out, but as the moderator and the kind of the host of the session, it's or sort of facilitator, is your role to basically to call it out and be as polite as you can, and just say, I think someone may be having two microphones on in some way, and try and triage the problem, but take ownership over it, because it's okay, it's fine, it happens. And then one of the other things that we talked about is confusion, and inevitably sometimes that happens. You do your best to try and explain something as simply as possible, but call it out and enable people to even just message you privately if they've got a specific question on one of the tasks and exercises that you're doing. And finally, one of the other points is just around timings. So sometimes this happens, you kind of get into a really deep discussion and debate about a particular issue, and find that your agenda that you've planned out so carefully isn't staying to time. And that's fine. One of the things to do is just take a break, kind of at your next available break, have a pause and think about, what do we need to still achieve? Perhaps what things can be done asynchronously, take those offline and do those things independently, and then come back into another session or have some other way of reporting back. But it's okay if things aren't going quite to the agenda, but just make sure to not lose track entirely of the meeting itself. Okay, so that's been a whistle-stop tour through our view of remote workshops. We do think that actually there's a real place for them in kind of today's world as we see it, but also tomorrow, which we don't know how things will look. But for sure, taking this digital-first approach to remote workshops has a real place. So if you want it, that kind of checklist of things to do when hosting a remote workshop is available. You can grab it and download it from Codehouse website, just /Figaro-workshop. Feel free also, there's a kind of details on that page as well to try out a free workshop with the Codehouse team. Also just to have a quick chat if you're already planning something and just want some quick bits of advice, we'll be more than happy to have a little chat. And most importantly, with any of these workshops, make sure to have fun and stay alert during your workshops. Thanks so much. And of course, if there are any questions in the Q&A, I'd be more than happy to answer those in a few minutes. Thank you.